Hello and welcome back to the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. The Freewheelin Bob Dylan marked a significant turning point in Dylan's career and folk music in general. Dylan's transition from traditional folk songs to original songwriting revolutionised folk music, introducing a new era of the singer-songwriter. The album's socially and politically charged lyrics addressed contemporary issues, influencing the civil rights movement and anti-war protests. Its enduring popularity and influence on music, culture and society established Dylan as the voice of his generation and cemented its legacy as one of the greatest and most important albums of all time. Joining me to discuss this album is my co-host, Mr. Felipe Amorim. How you doing, man?
Doing great, and you, man?
Yeah, very well, thank you, very well. Folk music. I'm quite excited.
You like folk music, don't you?
Well, I feel like, yeah, we did. Maybe you could say we did a bit of folk music with Genesis, maybe, but that's still prog rock, isn't it? But yeah, anyway, let's jump straight in. So just a reminder, please, if you're watching us on YouTube, please give us a like on this video and hit subscribe so you stay up to date with our content. And if you're listening on Spotify, Amazon or Apple, do us a massive favour and give us a review. It takes 20 seconds of your time, but does the world of good for us, as we're an independent podcast who do this for our absolute and undying love for music, and your quick review will give us better ratings, which means the algorithm takes us higher up the charts and means we are seen by more people. So please do us that favour, we'd really appreciate it. So the Freewheelin Bob Dylan, some quick facts about it. So it was released May 27th 1963, recorded over the course of 1 year between April 24th 1962 and April 24th 1963. That's crazy to me, how the same day, apparently. The studio it was recorded at was the Columbia A Studios in New York City, and the general genre is folk, although I've seen blues mentioned, and we'll touch on that. The length of the album is just under 45 minutes, and it was released through Columbia with producers John Hammond and Tom Wilson. So yeah, this album, I just want to start off with a bit of background in terms of where we were and where Bob Dylan was by the time this album came out. So before the Freewheelin Bob Dylan, this was his second album, wasn't it? Yeah. And before that, he was just known primarily as a performer of traditional folk songs, wasn't he? He did covers. I think his first album, there was 13 tracks and 11 of them were covers of traditional folk songs and 2 of them were originals. And in 1961, so 2 years before this album, 1 year before the writing and recording of it, he moved to New York City, where he was deeply influenced by the social issues going around at the time. And that's where we're going to go into first, the lyrics and the politics. So do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think when you said folk music, and I think it's proper folk music, isn't it? Because it's acoustic guitar, harmonica, and vocals, and that's the essence of the album. It's kind of well, before we talk about the political side of it, I would say that this is before he went electric. Before, some people criticized him a lot when he added electric guitars, and he had the band playing with him and all that stuff. So that's before he was a big name in the industry, and he also had to prove himself with this album. The label wanted to drop him, right, because they didn't like the first album, and was it John Hammond who produced the album and actually is the guy who signed him for the label. Let me just double check if I'm right about this.
Yeah, the producers, John Hammond and Tom Wilson.
Yeah, John Hammond was the guy who got Dylan signed with the label, and he convinced them to give him another chance with this album. So that's his second chance with the label. The label wasn't happy. He wasn't the famous Bob Dylan we know now. So it's kind of an interesting context that they generated the album. Not an easy time in his life, I'd say. And so not an easy time for America, post the Second World War, the whole fear of nuclear apocalypse with the Cold War and all that stuff. And I think he managed to capture that. When you say he's the voice of his generation, that's the political side of it. And he doesn't like that. He doesn't like being called the voice of a generation. I think his music...
he just felt like a guy doing what he loved.
Exactly. And maybe because he's a guy with the guitar, singing about things that everyone was talking about.
Yeah.
So he's a regular guy who happened to have a louder voice, and he was really, really good with words. So of course he became the voice of a generation. Either he wants it to be the the label for him or not. That's how he will be remembered, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think the interesting thing about the political side of it is, as I said, he was getting a lot of influence from traditional folk music, English folk music, and some of his melodies are borrowed from those songs. We say borrowed, really, because like plagiarism is a complicated thing, especially when you're talking about folk music and blues and other styles. And he would pick melodies from folk songs and kind of change them slightly and change the lyrics and come up with his own version of it.
Okay.
But he's not entirely political. He was talking about the issues of the time. And one thing I want to, one subject I want to touch about the social issues, I guess. I think one major thing is his approach on war, because up to this day we have the same sort of structure, political structure leading to wars, which is like a bunch of rich old men with their plans, with their, you know, what they believe is the best thing for the world, or the best thing for them. And they create the structure that leads to war. So basically, Dylan talks about building to destroy. That's what they do. They build it up so they can destroy it. There's a really beautiful line in the third song called "Masters of War."
Masters of War. Yeah.
Yeah, you put a gun in my hands and you hide from my eyes. So that for me sums up what the war is. It's politicians and the so-called important people with a lot of money and influence. They start the war and they give you the gun. Go there and fight for whatever ideology I came up with, so you can die and I'll be happy, you know, sitting on my chair and you know, in my expensive mansion somewhere. Yeah. So I think he goes straight to the point. There's not much to interpret from that song. You know, it's all said like straight in your face. And I don't know. You know, we talk a lot about freedom of speech nowadays and everything. I don't know how was it for him to say this at that time, if he felt like, well, am I going to be in danger for saying these things? Or
I've got the perfect thing, because can I answer that?
Yeah.
I'm going to answer it with a little bit of history of folk music, because it's going to tie in, you'll see. Yeah. So folk music, this is probably the first time, I think, isn't it, on this podcast we've done an out-and-out folk album. Yeah. And what we mean, I mean, what do we mean by folk? We don't want to dwell on this too long, but I think a very folk music instruments. I think of a guitar, a banjo, you know, the lute, and I think of medieval British music from the 1600s, the 1500s. That's what I think of as folk, and then obviously it's been passed down the generations. Yeah. So I've done a little bit of research on the history of folk music, and obviously I have by no means touched every aspect of it, but the generalized history of American folk music. So I'll go through this quickly, and you'll see actually it's before Dylan it started intertwining with politics. It's really cool. Check this out. Mm-hmm. So 1600s, yes, we are going back that far. The 1600s. Wow. European immigrants, mainly from Britain, began settling in the newly discovered United States of America, bringing their musical traditions, including ballads, work songs, and spiritual music with them. In the 1700s, they'd adapted to their new environment, blending different traditions from the European countries that came over to the US, as well as African American influence and traditions that also came over from Africa to the US. Now, in the 1800s, you have a continuation of these traditions passed down orally through generations, reflecting on everyday life, the struggles of working class people. That's the important part. In the 1800s, these folk songs became about the struggle of the working class. But as well as this, in the 1800s, you started incorporating historical events into songs, like the Civil War, like the struggles, you know, like we were saying. Now, the early 1900s, and you and me studied this at university, John and Alan Lomax were two ethnomusicologists. What a word, ethnomusicologist. So obviously...
Sounds important.
It does, doesn't it?
It actually is.
Ethnic, so ethnic musicologists. So studying the history of different ethnicities and the music. In the early 1900s, they went all around the US, documenting and recording folk songs from around the different parts of America. If I'm not mistaken, they discovered Muddy Waters?
No, I think they discovered Lead Belly for sure. I think
Muddy
Waters was influenced by those recordings.
Okay, maybe Anyway,
and actually, you can date back to that time. If you want to talk about any pop singer, any rock singer nowadays, they all have an influence of somehow they directly or indirectly influenced by the
Lomaxes.
the Lomax.
Yeah. It is the
recordings,
basis, as Felipe's just said, it is the base of all popular Western music. Because once they started recording these, it just expanded. You started off with small folk and blues, and as you guys know, from blues we got rock, and from folk we get this, and it just went on. So yeah, you're right. But anyway, they went around, they started recording everyone and documenting these folk songs. Now in the 1930s, the new wave of folk revived that spoke to the struggles of common people. So this is 100 years after we first started seeing
so we have a new wave of folk.
A new wave of folk in the 1930s. Songs like Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land" were quite prominent. As I usually say in every episode, if you're new to this, every song we mention in this episode will be in a dedicated playlist in the show notes below. So go down, click the playlist, and you can kind of listen along with us. 1940s folk, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Leadbelly emerge as hugely influential folk revival figures, popularising it and associating it with labour movements, civil rights movements and anti-war protests.
Yeah.
Now in the 1950s, because of this, many folk musicians became blacklisted due to their leftist political affiliations. But folk still managed to thrive in the underground scenes. And in the 1960s, one of those underground scenes was Greenwich Village in New York City, which became a hub for folk music's 60s revival. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Phil Ochs, all these guys were sort of playing in these underground Greenwich scene. You still had the period of massive social and political unrest in the United States, but folk music surged among students in colleges as music was starting to tackle social issues, so they got on board with it. And I think just related to this album, the civil rights movement, as I already said, was gaining momentum, and songs like Oxford Town in this album really demonstrate how active he was in trying to put across his political views. So there you go. That's a very quick history of folk music from the 1600s to the 1960s. But I think it, like I said, I haven't touched everything, but it touches the most important parts, right?
And you can see how he is basically continuing the tradition. He's not he's not reinventing the wheel, right? He's just doing his own thing with coming from an old tradition of telling stories about the daily lives of common people. Through music. So music is an instrument. So that's why maybe it's so simple, because it's quite interesting that apart from the song Corina Corina, there's no other musicians involved in the album, isn't it? It's one song with a band, and the rest of the album is Dylan on his own.
Harmonica or guitar.
Which I said a million times in this podcast, you prove that you're a good songwriter if you can play your song with an acoustic guitar or piano only, and it still sounds good.
Yeah, no, completely agree.
So the album is all about storytelling.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's no cheating. There's no I'm going to do this amazing production with orchestras and this and that, so to make me sound good. It's just Dylan and his stories and his view of the world.
Don't you think it's more about listen to the words I'm saying as opposed to the music I'm playing? And I think we've often discussed, haven't we, that is Bob Dylan a musician? Obviously, because he writes and makes music, but is he a musician properly, or is he a poet that learnt to put music behind his words? I think that's an interesting debate we can have one day on another episode. But talking of the words, obviously we said, not all of the album is political.
No, not all of it.
The ones that matter, and the reason this album is such a hugely important album, politically, societally, and musically, is because of the songs that are political. So you've got "Blowing in the Wind," which talks about the nature of war and inequality. I mean, that was the first ever Bob Dylan song I heard, actually. "Masters of War," as you said, is a criticism of the arms industry and those who profit from war. Oxford Town addresses racial tensions and inequality in the South USA. And there is literally, what's the line? He says, I can't remember it, but it's like, I'm not going to try and remember it, but he says, like, you can't do this or that because of the color of your skin. And then in the second verse, it's like, you can't do this because you have black skin or brown skin.
And Oxford Town is
so straight to the point.
Yeah, it is. And it's basically putting himself in that guy's position. It's like someone else's point of view. So this black man goes to a new town and he's not welcome there because he's black. So the way he tells the story, it makes you feel like, oh, that's how it feels. Obviously, you can never know how someone else feels, but it gives you an idea of how it must have been to be that person in that situation.
And didn't it
even
feel
even
horrible?
though it's probably not one, like it's not a real story about
Yeah.
a specific person. It might not be, but it's a
didn't
story that happened to millions of people. So
but didn't it feel horrible to you as a listener?
it's shocking,
It's
and
not
I think
nice.
it's not nice. And the thing is, when you touch in, those subjects like this, and the song I've mentioned, the third song of the album, Masters of War, it makes you think about, like, okay, there's inequality out there. There's the fear of another world war that can be even worse than the second one. So all that stuff, and it gets a bit heavy. So I love the fact that he brings a bit of humor to his music as well. The last couple of songs, there's a lot of it, and it's very lighthearted. And I think track 12, Honey, Just Allow Me One More Chance, is hilarious. You got to check it out.
No,
And
it is.
so it's good to hear some of that stuff, because again, that's storytelling. You must remember, even in periods of a lot of tension and wars and civil unrest, people still go out to dance, to drink, to have a good time,
To enjoy music,
and to enjoy music. So some of those songs about, like, this is how, like, it's ordinary people, like the I think it's the last song is a drunk man, isn't it? Like, talking about all the funny things that happen to him when he's drunk. So it's it's cool to have that in the album. I think I'll be honest with you, I love all the political stuff, but I think I wouldn't feel good at the end of the album if there wasn't a little bit of humor, a little bit of
I mean, just look at that song, A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. The lyrical stuff in that is nuts. Catastrophic damage by war, dozens dead, social injustice of marginalized groups. What is he said something about? He sees the downfall of 7 forests or something, and he's talking about, like, a forest on each of the continents. My God. And then, you follow it up with God on Our Side. Which I think is a really important song, actually, because he criticizes the use of religion and patriotism to justify war and violence. So it is overall a massively, whilst he does talk about marginalized societies and minorities and how, the life of a black person living in USA in that time, I feel like the overriding message is war equals bad.
Yeah.
It's very heavy on
exactly.
that, isn't it?
Yeah. And equality as a thing, like
as a sub theme.
as something that would say, like, why do some people have to struggle instead of having the same chances, same opportunities as everyone else, or being treated equally as well? So that's definitely a big part of it. But I think it's not. In some ways, it's like pointing a finger at society and kind of trying to shake things up a little bit, like, guys, let's pay attention to these things. They are going on right in front of you. And I want to mention the single "Blowing in the Wind," because everyone knows the song. It's a beautiful song, and what I like about it is a little bit more open, because it's not targeting one aspect of the social issues of the time. It's basically saying, there's some wrong things going on there, and they are happening. So don't turn a blind eye. And if you're looking for an answer, it's blowing in the wind, right? So it's there. So the thing is, it's not like we're not capable of changing things or changing ourselves. It's not like you need to go really far to find the answers for your own problems or whatever. What I think is good about Blowing in the Wind, because it's a bit more open and not so straight to the point, I would say. It can be interpreted in a million different ways, and it might be a good song for you to reflect on your own life. How many more things should happen to you until you take control over your life? It could be interpreted like that as well.
That's a great point, and I think he doesn't. What a lot of musicians and people who are really political do is they tell you how they're feeling, and they make it clear that I disagree with this. Whereas I feel like in a bunch of these songs, Bob Dylan is saying, well, I might feel this way, but how do you feel about it?
Yeah.
Tell me, what do you think of all this stuff that's going on? And I think that's really good, because he pushes it back on the listener.
Yeah, and not giving you the answer. Where is the answer?
Yeah, you find the answer. It's up to you.
You got to find the answer. I'm not giving it to you. Yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about lyrically, politically?
Just one song, Down the Highway. It's
Oh,
just
funny
because
one isn't that one, isn't it? A bit
yeah,
bluesy.
it's exactly because that's me. I need to touch on the subject of blues, of course. So that is an interesting one because it's a conversation between the guitar and vocals, like and it's phrasing on guitar and then singing something. And there's something he said about his blues influences and the blues singers, and he said the great names of the blues, they've managed to write songs in a way that the new generation, what he called the new generation at the time, couldn't do, which is the blues would be about their personal struggles, but they would be standing outside that situation, observing it, and defeating the the enemy, whatever the enemy was.
Right.
Like, so maybe what it basically said about the great blues singers at the time was like they would be analyzing their own problems, complaining about them, of course, but ultimately overcoming the problems and
Well, that links to what
becoming
we said,
stronger.
isn't it?
Yeah, and whilst it, according to Dylan, then the next generation of blues was just about moaning about stuff and not actually taking action and not actually changing your life.
Well, let's talk
it's
about
a really
the moaning.
good take about that. Yeah,
Let's talk about the moaning and let's move on to the musical characteristics.
Yes,
because
yes,
Bob
yes.
Dylan is known for his nasally voice, and let's be honest. Let's just be honest. We love Bob Dylan for what he's done, but he's not the best singer. We know this, and I mean, is he even a singer? You know, does he talk more than he sings? And I thought that was really interesting, especially on some of the songs like the Down to the Highway one, a few others where he had this real conversational aspect to his voice. But not only that, things he was doing, like there's one of the songs, like I wish I wrote it down, I can't remember, where he goes like, he does this sound with his voice where he goes like, yeah, and I just thought that sounds like Leadbelly. I thought that sounds like an old blues singer. So I think it's fantastic because up until this album, I've never heard or seen the connection between 1930s blues and 1960s folk music. Because I see how the blues then went on to rock, and I see how folk went on to do this, but I've never connected them, even though in that history, John and Alan Lomax, they went and got the blues artists as well. It was blues and folk they did. And I never saw how they connected. But I'm seeing it now with Bob Dylan literally taking vocal influences from it. Yeah. Most of the songs, he does something that I'd expect Leadbelly to do, or you know, Muddy Waters, a kind of vocal style, a vocal phrase he does. Even that part, what's he do at I think it's at the very end of the very song, where he's like, "Not all of you can be right, but some of you be wrong. I think Abe Lincoln said that," and it's like he's literally having a conversation. And I thought, if you hear Bob Dylan in the later '60s or into the '70s, it's much more less of that.
So it's interesting now because when you think about the vocal style and the conversational kind of voice, that is something that no one could do like him as well. So if you analyze his vocals under the technical point of view, and that's something I said to some friends of mine long ago when they started doing those TV shows like The Voice and all that stuff. I'll tell you this: guys like Bob Dylan or Mark Knopfler, you know, they would never win on one of those TV contests right. Because it's like, all right, it's all about having reaching the highest note and staying there for as long as possible with loads of vibratos and all that stuff. Like, well, does that make you a good singer? Yeah, technically, but does that emotionally connect with the audience? Can you write a song as well? Can you just sing someone else's song, you know, with more technical
prowess?
Prowess. Yeah, exactly. So is it necessary to be extremely good technically to deliver a message? I think it depends on the style, depends on what you're doing, and I think we have to have people like Dylan singing with their own unique voice and delivering a message that's more important than anything else.
You wouldn't change it for anything, would you? Despite how sometimes it does great up against your ears, you wouldn't change it.
I love other people singing his music as well. But you know what? Do you know what is interesting? I think the band does a great job singing his stuff. But I think there's something special about Jimi Hendrix when he does Dylan, for one simple reason. He also has a conversational kind of vocal. Although his voice sounds nothing like Dylan,
great point.
Jimi Hendrix approach to singing was really laid back as well. So it's not like he wasn't trying to. So maybe you have the guitar, you have the band, you have all that kind of music, how can I put it? You have a stronger kind of background music there going on with guitar, bass, and drums, but the voice doesn't actually try. Hendrix's voice wasn't taking the music in a complete different direction. He was just making Dylan sound more like Dylan, and that's why Dylan loved his versions of his songs. Anyway,
that's a great point. Yeah. So back to the musical characteristics. I mean, it's so obvious. We don't need to talk too much about it. It's just guitar and harmonica for the most part of it, and I think the rawness and how stripped down it is what makes this so connecting to the audience. It's like he's playing in your living room. It's like it's simple yet effective playing. It's a solid foundation for his lyrics. You know, he's got to do it well on the guitar for his lyrics and the singing to carry weight. He's got to lay a solid base on the guitar, and he does that. Like I said before, I think the emphasis is on the message of the songs more than the importance of the content and the emotion, sort of.
Yeah.
Anyway, shall we now move on? Let's talk about the innovations of this album, because we need to know, or maybe our listeners want to know, why this is considered one of the greatest albums of all time. And we've already mentioned things like the strength of the lyrics, the political affiliation it has, how stripped back it was. But I want to talk about three things here. This is the introduction of original songwriting in folk music. Because as I mentioned in the little history thing, you've got songs being passed down generation to generation.
And no one knows who wrote those songs, right?
No one knows, because they came from the 1600s. They were brought over from England or from Africa. And the lyrics have been changed to suit the situation every 100 years maybe. But in his debut album, 11 of his 13 tracks were covers. In this one, they're all his own. I think they're all his own. I will double check that. But the majority of this album are his own for sure. And that's really important because it shifted from traditional folk to original folk, and it just everything went off from there. And that'll actually lead me on to my next point about the innovation, the influence on the singer-songwriter movement. Bob Dylan kicked off what we know to be the singer-songwriter movement. Anyone you can think of that came afterwards, my favourites, I go to Carole King, James Taylor, Cat Stevens, all of these guys. Bob Dylan kicked it off by saying, start writing your own songs. And what also he did is he connected folk to pop music, because his folk music became popular. Evidently, it ticks both boxes, pop and folk. And that's where people like James Taylor and Carole King, especially in America, you've got guys like Cat Stevens over in England doing the same thing, but that's where in America it mainly kicked off.
And it's
just
interesting
a man
because
or a woman and their guitar or piano writing songs from the heart, as opposed to thinking about the big production behind them.
Exactly, and there's something interesting. He could have gone down another path by just like, well, I've got a bunch of good songs here. I'm gonna go to the label and try to sell these to the label, in a way, like maybe see if one of their singers wants to sing this, because like that's still obviously done in music nowadays, but it was a big thing back in the day where songwriters and artists would be different people. You have one person writing for the other person to sing. Absolutely. And they said, no, I'm singing my own songs. That's my thing,
Yeah, and just to confirm, 2 tracks are not written by Dylan on this album. Karina Karina is a traditional one, so we don't even know the writer because it came from so long ago. And Honey, Just Allow Me One More Chance, he wrote alongside Henry Thomas. So yeah, it was Dylan and Henry Thomas who wrote that together. Excellent. Right. So the innovations and pioneering, I think I finished what I wanted to say on there. Let me just go to my notes. Oh yeah. And the last part is the establishing the album as an artistic statement. As you just mentioned, we're used to hearing Elvis have songs written for him sing them, and they go out as singles. But this is, again, the early beginnings of finding someone who said, I'm going to write a collection of songs. They're not all going to be hits. They're going to have different themes, different lyrical ideas, but I'm going to put them on one album for everyone. And we saw only, 3 or 4 years later, the Beatles did it with Rubber Soul, where they said, we don't care so much about hits. We care about the collection of songs. This is what my life was like at this time. This is what me and the world were going through. Take these collections of songs as for what they all individually are, as well as collectively. So yeah, treating the album as a cohesive statement.
And the artwork reflects all of those things you just said, because basically, so this is an interesting. What I have on my background is not the album cover; it's one of the outtakes of the album cover. And it's interesting because basically the photographer was sent by the label to go to Dylan's flat in New York and take a few pictures of him. So you can find those pictures on the internet. Like there's a lot of pictures of him playing his guitar, trying different hats. It's like kind of trying to do something more well produced. Coming up with whatever concept, but they wanted to show Dylan in his own environment. But his girlfriend, Suze Rotolo, she was living in Italy, studying art in Italy, and she moved to America and moved into his flat, and she was there. So it wasn't planned that she would be in the album cover with him. She was there in the flat, and some of the pictures, he wanted to take by her side. And then at some point, the photographer said, "Let's go out in the streets, because like the flat is choose more. I want to see you like I want to use more of the background. There's no space here." And this beautiful picture of the two of them walking side by side lovely, in New York. It's a lovely picture. I think that could be that picture on itself. It's a great piece of art. I think it's beautiful, beautifully taken, and it does reflect a young man in America at that time with his girlfriend in the streets, and he's like, and you can see, I don't know, I think his body language shows a little bit of how can I put it, like uncertainty,
Yeah, I see that, and I also see modesty. I see, if you imagine a picture, I'm imagining Bob Dylan, 10 albums in with all his money, you take a photo, you're like this, surely, or you're flexing.
Yeah.
You're like, Bob Dylan. But he's just, hunched over, a bit modest, a bit humble. He's still a guy finding his way through the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, great point about the art.
That could have been any other couple in New York.
Exactly.
He is a common man walking down the streets of New York. It's a beautiful picture.
You've spoken about this, about art. And this is another thing this album does so importantly, is it's not just an influence on art and politics. Poetry and literature. Bob Dylan's lyrical style has often been compared to works of poet. I mean, I've got some notes here. Allen Ginsberg, he's been compared to a poet, Allen Ginsberg. I don't know who that is. I don't know what his poetry is like. But you've got credited experts in these industries saying, well, hold on, actually, this guy who's just writing simple folk music, his words actually remind me a lot of this poet here. And Bob Dylan's work has been referenced in numerous films, and his own lyrics, they portray such an imagery to them, like he's describing a film scene. Why wouldn't you take some of his music and put it in a movie? How much of his music has been in movies, But check this out. This is the most important part, and the one that I loved most. Do you know that he won a Nobel Prize in 2016?
I didn't know that.
No. Quotes, for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition.
Oh, actually, I remember when it came up in the news. Now that you're saying, yeah.
I just think that's brilliant. When you think of, but I don't think it's undeserved. I think when you think of all the people that have won it, and yes, you talk about the scientists who have cured this disease and cured that disease, this album is just so much more than a collection of songs. That's actually the first line of my monologue, so I'm plagiarizing myself. It's so much more than a collection of songs. It is. Do you know what? I'm not, because that's just my monologue. You tell me what you think about it. No, tell me what you think about it.
No, I think,
winning a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I think it's deserved, because is bringing poetry into music in a way that no one has done before. So that's why it's so important. Like, it's like, okay, I could just write a book, but I'm going to sing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it is. And that sums up the album for me. That's what it is. And the album could have been 13 different books or 13 different movies.
Yeah.
Instead, it's 13 songs. Yeah. So I think it's just, I loved listening to it start to finish. And there's a variety of themes, and reflects life at that specific point in time in all its complexity. It's not just the politics, it's not just love, it's not just fun, it's everything. That's his life, and that's ordinary people's lives summed up in music.
It's a musical photograph, isn't it, taken at a point in time.
Yeah,
excellent.
Exactly.
So just in terms of the legacy, we've already told you that many of these people consider this album one of the greatest albums to ever have been written and released. I hope you can understand and appreciate that whilst it may not have stunning production, amazing solos, I hope we've kind of pointed you in the direction as to why this is so important. Just some accolades it's received, it was praised upon release for its ability to capture the spirit of the times, which is what you just said. Ranked number 97 on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums. 2002, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. The album peaked at 22 on the Billboard 200, which actually wasn't that high. But as his popularity grew, the album continued to grow as well, and it sold more copies. It eventually really reached platinum status, selling 1 million copies in the USA. So yeah, any final thoughts on the album?
I just, as usual, recommend everyone to listen to it. Listen to it, like take your time, put your headphones on, or listen to it at home, enjoying your cup of tea or your coffee or whatever you want to do. And it's like, appreciate the music. I think it's beautiful start to finish. You got to listen to the lyrics, got to pay attention to it. I had a great time listening. It's the first time I've listened to this whole album. The other thing I would recommend is to listen to second track, Girl from the North Country. There's a beautiful version of Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan singing it together. It's slower,
really?
So slower tempo, it's a different vibe. And yeah, they sound amazing together. So yes, there's a million versions of it, but that's my favorite.
Well, it is in our playlist. So as I said, go down there and check out the playlist. Time for my monologue?
Yes, please.
There you go. Right. So before the monologue is always the last part of the show, right? Round up my thoughts. I always have so much to say, so I try and squeeze them into a little paragraph. Before we do the monologue and finish, please just a reminder, if you're watching on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple, Amazon or Spotify, go and rate us. It takes a little bit of your time, but means the world of us. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. So, I think the Freewheelin Bob Dylan is much more than a collection of original songs by an up-and-coming folk musician. Whilst not all the songs are politically motivated or a lyrical form of protest, it stands as a peaceful reminder that everyone has a voice. I can't imagine how your bog-standard American would have reacted to some of the lyrics we hear in the album, and not because they are right or wrong to agree or disagree with him, but to think back and imagine what was happening societally in that time. It must have been quite a statement to have released some of these songs with some of these lyrics. The simplicity of the instrumentation and music allows his message to be delivered in a much more prominent way. Don't focus on his chords or melodies, focus on his words. The album is a hopeful record. Despite how dark and doomy some of the lyrical content is, I can't help but smile when I hear some of the chord progressions and the simplistic melodies being delivered by this quirky character with unusual phrasing and vocal choices. This positivity in a world full of negativity must have been why it stood out and why so many people not only enjoyed his music, but more importantly, rallied behind him in his political and societal pursuits for what he believed was a better future for America and ultimately the world.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Great album. And now, and this is more than just a great album in time. This kickstart a career of one of the most notorious and well-known songwriters in existence in Western music altogether, right?
Yeah, and and every single song of the album is good. That's not an easy thing to put together.
Good point. And I actually can't wait to do another Dylan album next. So maybe we do this chronologically. Maybe in a few months you'll see the next album. But yeah,
let's do some of the electric stuff.
Oh, we'll get on that. Yeah, excellent. Cool. Right. Well, guys, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Long Live Rock and Roll podcast. We hope you come back and join us very soon.
Thanks everyone for being with us once again. Keep on rocking, everyone, and don't do anything I wouldn't do.
And as usual, take care, guys, and long live rock and roll.